Good evening, Augustonians. Welcome back to Lit Friday, and welcome if this is your first time with us. For newcomers, Lit Friday is a monthly virtual conversation from the August Wilson African American Cultural Center, premiering on the organization's YouTube channel the final Friday of each month. My name is Jessica Lanay, the host, producer, and curator. I am also an art writer, poet, and essayist. To keep up with new future episodes and replays from our archives, follow the August Wilson African American Cultural Center on Instagram at August Wilson Cultural Center, and follow me as well at @hanginThere_kitty. Tonight, I'm excited to welcome our guest, Colter Harper, for a discussion of his 2024 publication from the University Press of Mississippi, Jazz in the Hill, Nightlife and Narratives of a Pittsburgh Neighborhood. Amazing covers, an image from the legendary Pittsburgh photographer Teenie Harris on the cover. Love to see his work in action in the world. Colter is a musicologist, musician, and teacher. His book, Jazz in the Hill, delves into the history of Pittsburgh jazz clubs as sites of entrepreneurialism, placemaking, labor organizing, and critical listening in the storied Hill District neighborhood. His research has appeared in journals including Jazz Perspectives, South African Music Studies, International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives, African Performance Review, and Fretboard Journal. Colter is a versatile guitarist and composer who owes a great deal to Pittsburgh's musical community, as well as his experiences traveling, performing, and studying in West Africa, Brazil, and Europe. In 2007, Colter joined the multi-platinum selling, world music-influenced rock band Rusted Root as a guitarist, percussionist, and vocalist. He recorded on the band's latest albums, Stereo Rodeo and The Movement, and performed with the band nationally until the summer of 2013. In 2018, Colter served as a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Ghana, where he created a music production teaching facility for the Department of Music. Colter is currently an assistant teaching professor in the university at Buffalo's Department of Music, where he develops courses in popular music and music technology. We're honored to have you. I have so many questions, and we're also just excited to hear you read from the book itself.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Okay, I'm going to read a bit from this chapter that gets a bit into the Crawford Grill and the hurricane. So the hurricane held its grand opening celebration on November 5th, 1953, 3 months after the Crawford Grill's celebrated reopening. Charles Teenie Harris's photograph of the night, which you see here, shows the club owner Anna Simmons Dunlap, who went by Birdie, and her husband William, who went by Shine, among the crowd, while organist Ruby Young, trumpeter Chuck Austin, and bassist Bobby Boswell perform on the race stage behind the bar. Though the business was a joint venture, Birdie took on the role of manager, who, as the Pittsburgh Courier city editor and journalist Frank Bolden later recalled, quote unquote, patrolled the place like a drill sergeant. Musicians and audiences remember a tough, professional, and elegant woman who rarely took a drink, smoked, or cursed. Her personality and presence were inseparable from the hurricane's reputation as a warm and welcoming environment. And though she did not tolerate behavior that she felt was inappropriate, men who were being disrespectful to women or used profanity were kicked out. Though there was never a cover charge, she may have removed those who were not purchasing drinks or food to make space for more lucrative customers. Dunlap was personally involved with seating, serving, and generally catering to her patrons. Relaxed and attentive in this photograph, she stands with the menu in hand, taking orders from a packed booth. At the same time, she looks over her shoulder to survey other patrons, possibly calculating where to seat new arrivals. Shine, dressed in a tuxedo and sitting at the bar, observes Teenie Harris taking the photograph of the scene while his wife remains engrossed in her task. Regulars and performers alike learned that Dunlap's rule was absolute when it came to admitting patrons, though she was accommodating to those who valued the music. Guitarist Tony Jamplone Sr. remembers Dunlap allowing comedian Richard Pryor to perform during a 20-minute intermission after he agreed to, quote unquote, keep it clean. After a few minutes, though, of his act, quote, these two guys in suits came on either side of him and his feet never touched the floor. They just threw him out. However, when aspiring underage musicians sought out the club to listen to their heroes in person, Dunlap would occasionally accommodate their enthusiasm. John Flown recalls going to the Hurricane as a teenager and being confronted by Dunlap, who generally discouraged minors. He says, she wasn't going to let me in, and I said, tell me where I can go to hear this kind of music, and I'll go. I know I'm underage, but I'm not underage to the point where I don't want to hear this kind of music. So she gave me a big hug, and I could go in there. Pittsburgh legend George Benson, guitarist, vocalist, also recalls Dunlap's support of his interest in the Hurricane as a place of musical education. So this is George Benson speaking. When you step into the Hurricane, there was this little cove right in the back of the door. As a young person, I used to stand there listening to music. I was too young to come into the place, and I didn't have any money to spend anyway. I guess I was about 15 years old, and I started sneaking into that little cove. People knew who I was. I was always famous in Pittsburgh from the time I was a little boy, so Bertie would come over and say, stay in that spot, don't move from that spot. That gave me the opportunity to hear some of the most talented people in America. Bertie's was very, very important to my musical growth. I got the chance to see what it was like for musicians such as Jimmy Smith and Johnny Hammond Smith, who were recording artists, and I watched their fame progress. That's how I learned my art, by listening to what they were doing and checking out how they lived. uh, one last thing here. So I'll jump ahead a little bit, but from 1956 to 1961, even as Bertie was building a reputation as this matriarch of this jazz house of organs, uh, the sound of this lower hill being cleared and the Civic Arena being erected was a pervasive reminder to nearby residents of the city's redevelopment. The Hurricane was only 3 blocks from the edge of this development site, but it provided an alternative sonic space in the neighborhood. A 1957 Pittsburgh Courier review reflected on these competing soundscapes. So this is a Courier review here. Bertie Dunlap's House of Organs is rocking in more ways than one this week, as the John Thomas Trio continues to shake up the Hurricane patrons. Tremors in the neighborhood during the past few weeks have been attributed to a variety of causes. Some have been blamed on the spectacular redevelopment project now going on a couple blocks below the bistro. Others resulted from the recent appearance of one James Smith. However, this week's shakeup is being attributed to the fact that the 300-pound stud has been putting a whole lot of weight on the tiny stand behind Bertie's bar as he drums for the Thomas crew. While meant to be lighthearted, the review is evidence of the oral impact of the redevelopment on the nearby community and residents, as well as the importance of the Hurricane as a home place where tremors, rocking, and shakeups are transformed from noise to healing sound. In this juxtaposition, the humble sight of the Hurricane's tiny stage, strained under the weight of drummer Chick Farley, rivals that one of the spectacular redevelopment that was swallowing 105 acres of the neighborhood. Such sensory experiences are muted in the photographs that document the destruction of the lower hill and architectural drawings of an idealized urban landscape. Studying the history of the Hurricane as a jazz house and home place reclaims the importance of the sonic environment that it provided for Pittsburghers. The creative, constructive processes of artists in the jazz house offers real alternatives to the extensive destruction required in realizing Pittsburgh's vision of rebirth. I'll leave it off there.
One of the things I love about that photo is the exchange of gazes that's there. If you look, you can see all of this diagonal engagement. It's like this silent talk that I think is like very common in like African American communities, like when you see someone across and there's an exchange of gazes. So even in just Teenie Harris's photo, you can see this deep communal engagement, right? This deep communal agreement to have an experience together, even through sight, as you talk about sound. And as I was saying before we began, the book is so phenomenal. There's so much detail, there's excellent organization, there's passion there. And so I wanted to know how you came to this project in the first place. And it's obviously a massive project. There's so much documentation, archival documentation about the Hill District that it could be daunting. So, how did you come to the project and what helped you take it on?
Great. I came to the project as a teenager. I'm an outsider to Pittsburgh. I moved here at the age of 15, and I had recently been interested in learning, what made this music called jazz function. How does it work? Because I was playing, Nirvana or the Beatles or all this different music, but when I heard Coltrane's Blue Train or Wes Montgomery's albums, I was like, there's a conversation happening here, and someone said, well, you need to go to a jam session and talk to musicians about how this happened. I ended up in the Hill District at the Hill Jazz at the Hill House, which was a Sunday jam session. And so it started to me as a question as a teenager of just, how does this music, how do I understand what's happening in this conversation and with these incredible artists? And just I think where we listen to music is as important to what we're listening to. And that was an experience of me. You can put a record on in your home and listen to it, but to go to a jam session is to navigate the city and learn about the city. And as a teenager, I was new to Pittsburgh, and I don't know where I heard this, or I was just saying, "Oh, I'm going to the Hill District for a jam session," and people said, or there's just like, oh, you're not supposed to go to this place. It's a place that has been a kind of isolated, and as a newcomer there, you're just absorbing things from media and from kind of generally held. So there was a cognitive dissonance there, and then going to this place, you encounter this incredible community with all this knowledge of Pittsburgh and ways of understanding Pittsburgh. And so it started as a question of that dissonance, like how does this history get erased? How did parts of the city become divested, and how do these histories become muted, basically? And that extended into me doing work at Duquesne as studying music at Duquesne, which you can look through your window of your classroom and see, St. Benedict the Moor on the top of the Hill District there. And not one of those classes mentioned the Hill District's contribution to this music we were studying. So again, another cognitive dissonance there that led me to ask questions. Um, and so I guess the subtext of this book, one of them is that I just wanted to rethink that how universities have kind of structured knowledge about jazz in terms of telling its history and communicating how to value the sound, and also the relationship of the music to the city and understanding the city, and thinking about where we listen to music and where we perform music as being as almost as important as what we're performing. So that's a bit of a long circuitous answer, but it was me trying to be a better guitar player, but then starting to ask questions about the experiences of how Pittsburgh is structured as a patchwork of communities.
It's very interesting. I became extremely personally invested in what you were writing early on because I purposefully moved to the Hill District um, from New York to do the MFA in creative writing at the University of Pittsburgh. And I said I wanted to live in the Hill District. So
Mhm.
I lived on the corner of Francis and Center, like, where the old YMCA is. I lived like maybe like half a block up before you get to the
Hmm.
next street, Montague or Montague.
Yep.
And I didn't realize, although I knew of August Wilson and knew some of the jazz history, I didn't realize that's actually across the street from where the Pittsburgh Courier used to be. There's a plaque
Hmm.
across the street
Yep.
from that YMCA. And so as I was reading, I could kind of connect my experience to the divestment that you're talking about right after the demolition of the lower hill, and then also what integration meant for the hill in terms of within the next 20, 30 years, public schools shutting down in the Hill District, um, certain kinds of public transportation being more and more limited to places that were not Oak Hill, which has now been gentrified by the University of Pittsburgh. And so I began to kind of piece those things together, as well as my own experiences. I have family now, friends that are family now in the Hill that are older. So I'm listening to their stories, and it seems like that disappearance you're talking about also happened when white flight happened. All of a sudden, the character of the Hill District changed because there are people that wouldn't deliver to me. There are friends that wouldn't, who are from Pittsburgh, who wouldn't come visit me. And I loved the neighborhood that I lived in, and loved my neighbors. And so there's this piece here that you're connecting the structural to the cultural and showing how they're directly connected, but that's not a story that's often told. Did you find that connection between the structural and the cultural in terms of music specifically difficult to narrate and kind of talk about explicitly in The Hill?
I I always knew that I wanted to have a place-centric framework for talking about music. And, there's a lot of theory you can draw on Henri Lefebvre, and like, there's a lot of critical theory out there that connects, culture to place, and there's cultural geography and all that stuff. I didn't know about that at the time, but I just knew that there was something important about the way that music is practiced in a location, and beyond just, getting a CD out of a store and putting it on in your house and being like, I love this music. But there's, how was that possible that this artistry was made? It's not just that there was genius that popped into someone's mind and they went out and recorded this record. There was a whole infrastructure of entrepreneurs and audiences and venues and networks of traveling and media, and like, all of that made this music possible. The creative process, I was just trying to think of the creative process beyond what you're hearing and trying to learn on a record, to extending all the way out to journalists writing for the Pittsburgh Courier, or just all of these different networks of organizers that made this artistry possible. And then, yeah, just trying to, I tell some of that story that I felt was intentionally being kind of muted and erased from our collective memory. The Hill District has always been the site of a place that's been. That's why I called, Nightlife and Narratives of Pittsburgh Neighborhood, because there's many narratives of the Hill District that coming from the different directions, all trying to create a certain depiction of its contribution and relationship to Pittsburgh. And that goes back to the early 20th century. It's been going on for, a long time. So I was just interested in the way that jazz was shaping those narratives from various perspectives. Um, and yeah, I think I got a little bit off your question, but
No, no, you're answering. You're answering. But I think, just to repeat, it's like, that piece that you say that people avoid, right? Like they avoid showing how the narratives reinforce either the erasure or not. Because I think when people think of art, they often have trouble connecting it to politics unless it has an explicit kind of symbolism. But when we're thinking about the art of music, there's symbolism there, but in terms of its temporality, it's kind of fleeting, right? And so unless you study, it's hard to remember. So it seems more difficult, aside from the most explicit examples, like James Brown on Black and I'm Proud, things like that. When we're talking about jazz that's wordless, that has different symbolic representations through quotes, et cetera, and runs, it's kind of something that has to be really explained. And I wanted to know if that's difficult, right? Was that difficult for you to show how the institutions began failing, right? The institution of Pittsburgh as a governing body began to fail this
mm,
great legacy that it
mhm.
has.
I think the thing that was really the advantage is the Teenie Harris Archive. And it's a very singular collection of images in terms of documenting a community. We don't have anything else like that in the world, let alone the United States. It's remarkable, just the breadth of it and the trust that everyone had for Teenie to represent them. You can see that in the images, because many of the images he's being looked at as he's photographing a scene. So he's the subject of the photograph as well. He's not just somebody who's popping in and taking a photograph on assignment. He is part of this conversation. And so the photos are very rich in terms of framing them wide. There's a lot of context. And so that connections that I think you're talking about emerge from stories that are told about these photographs. As a social scientist, that I'm trained as an ethnomusicologist, you go into interviews with people. You set up an interview and you go and you sit down. Um, Without the photo, me directing questions based on my research, talking about things that happened 50 years ago. With Teenie Harris's photographs there, then the interviewee becomes the expert. I'm just being taught how to see the image. And so
Mm.
those connections emerge out of the photograph. This is a thing called photo elicitation, which comes from visual anthropology. It's been done before in many contexts, but I was just kind of trying to apply that to saying, well, there's this incredible resource, this incredible details of all these interactions and spaces, and everyone's going to tell that story differently. Um, and and from that, we're talking about music, but the things that are emerging from that are all these connections that are harder to pin down. So for me, it was a very photo archive centric study and a race against time to try to meet people that were elderly, that had that knowledge. And that's a big part of the work that the Carnegie Museum of Art has also done, is that outreach as well. Because I started this project as they were digitizing the photographs. There's 80,000 photographs. It took them 7 years to do that. So
Hmm.
I was with them as they were like cleaning each negative off, scanning it, and they'd be like, "Oh, this week we got a bunch of new ones that you might like," and there was none of them were labeled. So you have a photo like this, and you have to figure out who the musicians are, what year it
Hmm.
is. You have to do all that cross-referencing. Had to get, old maps of insurance maps to figure out where these places had been. I mean, obviously Crawford Grill is still there, but every other place had been torn down by mid 1950s. And I remember there's all these photos of this incredible, the musicians club. I had a suspicion it was the musicians club, but I didn't have a direct line to say, and that was in Thad Mosley's house, who we know is the great artist, and he had a photo on his wall that had the same kind of architectural thing, and I was like, Thad, where is that? And he was like, oh, it's the musicians club. I used to go there all the
He's
time.
also an incredible archivist himself.
Exactly. Yeah. So
Yes.
you had to do things like that to be like, okay, now I have 25 photos that I know are from the same physical space that were very important. And then now we can start telling that story from all these different angles that are emerging out of those images. So it's a music study that doesn't have any music in it, in the sense of like ethnomusicologists tend to write out and notate music and study the sound. I'm not doing that as much in this.
So when you knew that you were going to write the book and you began to do the archival research, you said during the first question, like people were telling me I wasn't supposed to go there or that I shouldn't, feel that that was a safe space. And I
Hmm.
wondered if you had any hesitancy as a European American or white writer. Were you
Hmm.
concerned that you would receive a reaction that was basically, this isn't your story to tell? And if you did experience that, what helped you through? And if not, why?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a huge part of it. I'm an outsider to Pittsburgh. I'm an outsider to the Hill District. I'm a white, cisgendered male. Um, and obviously there's all that power dynamics is in front and center in my mind as I'm sitting here representing this community, especially writing a lot of this in 2020 and being and watching protests that are echoing all of these stories. So yeah, it's like um, there's that doubt and that pressure there to reconcile that role of going ahead. Uh, Part of it is I felt like I was positioned to tell at least this part of the story, and I hope that it's not the end of the story. It's just one step that maybe can be built on in a lot of different ways, and that story can be told in different ways. So I would like to think of it as a resource and a way of giving back, something to a community that's taught me quite a bit about American history and what it is to be an American. So my hope is that it is a resource and valuable in that sense. The book itself is a story about the Hill District as a place that was not isolated. It was a place of rare interracial socializing. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
story of um, white Americans and Jewish Americans and Italian Americans. Well, it's a story of a lot of these ethnic groups becoming white adjacent, and it's also a story of Black Americans creating spaces that were accommodating and truly integrated and imagining American society and in a imagine a future of American society. So I was able to experience that because of that tradition. I was welcomed in these spaces. I wasn't told I wasn't welcome there. Um, I was taught and given this knowledge. And so I was just trying to honor that history of that because I think that that knowledge is not limited to any. That's the gift of this musical knowledge is that it's meant to try to imagine an American society that's going to sustain us in some way.
No, I'm kind of a person that likes music documentaries and reading biographies of musicians. And there's one thing that comes out throughout the whole entirety of the book that's not, I would say, like explicitly stated, but there is this baseline camaraderie amongst the musicians that was really, really essential to webbing together all that the Hill District was and is. And it's like the music and the exploration of this and making place for this comes first, and we'll sort the rest out later. I notice in documentaries people finding gigs for one another, making sure that they had like the Rolodex open to making sure that young people had opportunities, watching the Luther Vandross documentary and learning about how many people musicians he worked with, or reading the Nile Rodgers biography about even if you had a fellow musician kind of fall down from a different community for various reasons, you made sure they worked. You made sure that you could get them back up on their feet so they could work together. And I wonder how much that camaraderie of musicianship you found kind of being one of the pillars, right? That kind of held up the Hill community and everything that it was and is.
I think that camaraderie extends beyond just the musicians. A lot of the when people talk about the Crawford Grill and the Hurricane as spaces, it was a place that created a very much wider collective sense of belonging. You know, jazz history tends to be taught from the perspective of the musicians on stage versus the world, kind of. It's like they're the artists and they're misunderstood and they're in this little world and everyone else is sort of like doesn't get what they're doing and they're just pushing ahead. That's not the case in this, that's not the story I'm trying to tell. I'm trying to tell a story of audiences listening to music, being challenged by that music, but also having a space where that challenge was understood as something. So you might not like everything that you're experiencing. Like there's a lot of stories of Ornette Coleman coming to the Crawford Grill. Ornette Coleman was still invited there to play, but it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. But I still believe that they experienced it as part of a collective that was, to me, I try to make the argument this was a conversation about modernity, the alternate versions or alternate imaginations of modernity in a time when American cities were going through rapid processes of modernizing, top-down modernizing. It was one of the biggest projects of urban redevelopment in the United States was in Pittsburgh, in the Hill District. The first major one that took, this coalition of mayors and millionaires, or equivalent of billionaires now, coming together and moving very quickly in terms of getting the power to claim property, to dislocate people, and to make these huge changes to the city in very short periods of time. That was happening in a way that had never happened before, and it was like this was kind of this was the starting point of that. And so,
I mean, all the while using, right, Le Corbusier, who's an architect and an architectural theorist whose work has been critiqued as being white supremacy adjacent, especially with how it's operated in northern Mexico, India. And so having that be the standard, right, for the
yeah,
redevelopment is also like quite problematic and excises so many communities, not just the African American community, right? But even like intercultural communities, right? If we're
Hmm.
thinking about recent immigrants that are Syrian, Jewish, etc.
Yeah. So yeah, I got excited by the idea of these, even though these were humble places, they were small places, they had big ideas about the way that the city could operate and what the future and modernity could look like in a way that I think was much more sustainable and in a way that, we just tore down the Civic Arena not long ago, and we're still kind of trying to figure out what to do with that space that heals these injustices. And I'm not sure if that's going to be successful or not, or, what the metrics are for determining whether that's successful or not. But um, it's a different model for thinking about what our cities deliver to us and how we live together in that city sustainably.
You had made a mention of the engagement between audience and musician, and you give beautiful descriptions of that in Jazz in the Hill, right? Where there's this kind of open conversation and critique that's happening between the musicians on the stage or people coming up to them afterwards and being like, I love this, had a question about that, like having this, almost like theory and community creating like an artistry and
Hmm.
also like a world in and of itself. And I wrote down beside those paragraphs call and response, which is one of the foundational aspects of West African music that we've inherited as African Americans and also
Hmm.
is inherited in other music as well. Like I one of my favorite memes, I think, is Pharrell talking to Dave Grohl and talking about the breaks at the beginning of Teen Spirit. And Dave Grohl is like, I stole that from the Gap Band. And the Gap Band got it from James Brown, and the and one comes from here.
Hmm.
And that was what came to mind when I was thinking about this feedback loop that we're continuing to benefit from. Last month, I interviewed Abiodun Oyewole of the Last Poets,
Hmm. I
and
saw that. Yeah.
they just recently set their first album of the Last Poets to Afro beats.
Hmm.
So we're still talking through sound. And in your research, in your work, how what did you discover or what surprised you about the details of that feedback loop between your experience in West Africa, specifically Ghana, and the studies that you did about jazz in the hill?
Um, I had the opportunity. I mean, I've spent close to 4 years living in Ghana. Look over the past 25 years, so I have this feel like it's a second home in many ways. And so, that music is very important to me also, and has really shaped my perspective about just what it means to make music as an artist and to think about the idea of repetition. This is a little abstract, but you talked about feedback loops, but just, the idea of a thing like a clave pattern surviving for 400 or 500 years and becoming the DNA of so much of our popular music, whether it's George Michael's faith, you gotta have faith.
Yes.
Like it's just there. It's in everything we do, or it could be like reggaeton, like some. It's just we've kept that, and that's and it's still a big part of us. Like we embody that in everything we do. It could be, country music or hip hop or soul or what. It's just so. Hearing, everybody that the common narrative of Africa is it's the source, but really I come to think of it as a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. There's always ideas moving back and forth between them. You know, the Afrobeat is very much a conversation with the United States, and so um, I call that sort of audience musician space of commonality, active listening. I think that's a concept that's maybe been used in other ways, but I have a section talking about active listening and just the importance of how physical spaces can structure that active listening. So these venues were very interesting in the way that the stage was located and the acoustics worked and sight lines and just the understanding of that dynamic that we lose a lot of the times. I Recently, I got to go see, Joshua Redman at the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild, and I saw Sean Jones at the Hazlitt Theater. But, we sat like this the whole time and we clapped after the solos, which is our cue to do that. But that's a different kind of active listening than would happen in these spaces. And Sean's played at the Crawford Grill, and I think he was one of the final artists to play there before it closed in 2003. Uh, it's a different dynamic. It's a part of the artist learning also about how to shape their craft as well. They're not just going in there and playing what they've been practicing. They're listening and thinking about their ideas in that moment in relationship to the dynamics of the makeup of the audience at that time. And those contingencies are very much like a big part of how music making still happens in West Africa, whether it's in a village in the Upper West region where you're performing and there's a body laid out there and you're literally playing music for 24 hours a day, or you're listening to Azonto in Accra at a bar or something like that. There's just so much incredible musical variety in a small place that's hard for us to wrap our brains around as Americans. Um, but for me, it comes back to just the idea of the power of ideas repeating and and that repetition being something that can generate new ideas. So I had, if you just play like a 3/2 clave once, that's one thing. Everybody can do that. But play that 7,000 times over 40 minutes while there's eight things happening around you. Your consciousness changes, your body changes, everything changes. There's a fundamental difference in repeating an idea 7,000 times that then makes you see the world in a very different way.
Or find new time in what is perceived to be a relatively short amount of time, and being able to find different places to hit in terms of variety, right? So
Yeah,
the
multiple
variation.
perspective is, yeah,
Yeah.
simultaneous multidimensionality is what one scholar calls it, if you want to get the ethnomusicology fancy language. But yeah, just taking something and slowly rotating it and seeing it from every facet that's possible.
Yeah.
It's beautiful because it
So
makes you
what
realize there's no one perspective that's dominant. That's
there's no one
ultimately.
perspective that's dominant, but it's also kind of a very cosmological, or because it's time space, right? It's playing with
Hmm.
time space, and the audience and the architecture and the location, like you said, creates a different kind of environmental pressure that is physical. It's physics based, right? That can change the quality of the music. You wrote about this in terms of playing at the Civic Arena. John Coltrane at the Civic Arena was totally differently received than when he was at the Crawford, or I think the Hurricane. And
He
so
was at the
it's
Crawford, yeah.
at the Crawford. And so you even acknowledging how the different acoustics and closeness of physical bodies in a space changes reception, which is an act of phenomenology, an act of
Hmm.
science, is created through improvisation, creativity, and risk and chance taking.
Mm.
And that was something that really sat with me as I was reading as well. But where are all the places you went, people you went to, places you went to gather all the information? I think it's important for viewers and listeners to be able to wrap their head around the material aspect of all of the things that you gathered together to tell the story and all the places you had to go.
Well, being a musician in Pittsburgh, you find yourself in a lot of weird little nooks that you wouldn't normally go to. I've played in people's homes, and I've played in the deli section of Giant Eagles for grand opening. I've done, as a musician, you just find yourself in weird places, a wedding or a jazz club or something, and you just learn to move through the city in a different way. And uh, there's a book, I'm trying to remember. Oh, Root Shock by Mindy Fuller. I'm looking it over here on the bookshelf. But she talks about, like, this paths that we make through a city and how they connect to our daily routines and helping us sort of just understand our relationship to the world, really. It's like our movement helps us kind of create our understanding of ourselves. And when that movement is disruptive, we get root shock. We don't know how to understand what's happening around us, and we become very so. Um, in terms of gathering this information, some of this was just going to the archive, printing out 200 photos, and then setting up a time with musicians and choosing about 10 of those and talking for 2 hours and then transcribing that interview and then coding it, which means, putting keywords next to paragraphs and getting hundreds of pages of this in an Excel document and just starting to like piece the story together. Uh, so that's like the meat and potatoes of gathering like oral history is just going out and talking to people. The Pittsburgh Courier is an incredible resource. And now newspapers.com has thousands of newspapers that are all digitized. So I've spent hundreds of hours just reading the newspapers from the past 120 years, um, and just getting a sense for the language and the style of journalism from various perspectives, which is again why I came back to this idea of narratives to connect to how these places were narrated. So just a lot of reading and downloading articles and organizing them. There's a whole section of this book which is just listing all the bands that played, and that was like a 12-hour a day for 2 weeks kind of thing, where I was just getting every possible listing of bands that played and then having calendars from those years and being like, okay, so this is printed on Tuesday. They're saying they're coming next Monday. So that would be this date. And there would be like, they didn't tell you they're coming from May something to May something. They would say, oh, they're coming for 5 days or 2 weeks. And you'd have to kind of do the math in your head, it was a really intense deep dive to try to put all that information together. So there's that, just sitting in front of your computer a lot, trying to like find the resources. And then you're reading a lot of literature, Sadia Hartman, all these incredible writers, and trying to think about what it means to tell these stories. Um, and yeah, the archive, the interviews, conversations, and then reading these newspapers. And then, like, the big part of telling the musicians union story was getting access to the court documents of that case. And that was a 500-page court, narrative of that what happened in
Mm,
the 60s. And that told a lot of social history through, we don't think about court cases as being oral history, but they are.
they
They're,
are.
if things don't go to court, those stories aren't told and aren't recorded. So,
Mm.
that was a big find for me and a huge resource to putting a lot of these pieces together.
So one of the things that also like is the timeliness of the book, right? There's the timeliness of the book and how the book rests in the current political moment. And you did excellent documentation and narrativization of the hardships of integration for musician unions, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and Pittsburgh. And you expose how white power structures or structures that are adjacent to that idea of white supremacy kind of sought to undermine integration or make integration a one-way street, right? You come to us. We're not interested in modeling the integrated society that you're already living in futuristically. As a
Hmm.
matter of fact, you give great documentation about how Black and tan clubs that were integrated, were harassed by police, harassed during Prohibition. And there's also this repetition of like a method for this, right? It's the violation of morals and values that are defined by the dominant people in society and in Pittsburgh at that moment. And it has so much connection to now, how so much um, racism, so much classism, so much misogyny, so much anti-queer sentiment is being hidden behind very ill-defined morals and values that when you kind of
Mm.
push on that a little bit, it collapses. It's like a paper cutout of morals and values. You push it and the wind takes it away and you realize what it's really about. As the book has lived and you've lived in the moment as well, has your perspective about anything within the book changed, or have you found that you've seen continuity between what you found in the moment that has either been a reaffirmation of you of the work, right? A reaffirmation for you of the work, or even just surprised you in how the same direct method is being used to undo what's actually like the fruit, the best of American society.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we're all still very much in the moment, I think, of the 1920s and the 1940s and the 1960s. Like all those moments are still, we're still in them very much right now.
Like all at once
And
now.
yeah, it's like I feel like the last century has sort of collapsed upon us, and a lot of chickens are coming home to roost, and not just in terms of like American politics, but America's relationship to Latin America and Central America. America, I've been thinking a lot about America as this bastion of democracy that's propped itself up on supporting the repression of democracy in a lot of parts of the world, and now that relationship, our kind of comfort in our democracy at the expense of other democracies, are really coming home to us now. Central America being a key part of that, I think, is it's like so. I think yeah, the framework that I take from this that's helpful for me, and I hope helpful for other people, is to think about this talks of the narratives and about morals and values as something that's very much can be a system of oppression and of yeah, like the narrative of a moral stance can be a system of oppression and erasure. So uh, we have to be very invested in trying to think about what perspectives we're building these conversations about moral stances from, and not just take it all for granted. And so yeah, integration is a one. Oh, sorry, that was the.
No, I saw
Did you see the cat? That's Hollywood, the
my
cat.
cat's been kind of patting me the whole interview, asking
Oh,
for
okay.
food.
Um, but one of the things you were talking about was this integration is a one-way street. So a big part of this story is this the way that jazz is telling a story about how social spaces were um, were by definition kind of multi-generational, multi-ethnic, racial, not to idealize those time periods, because white supremacy is still the dominant structure within which this is operating. So not to go back and say this is an idealized form of society, but it was a realization of society where a lot of things that were impossible were possible, and also again accommodating LGBTQ perspectives, and especially queer performers, what were called female impersonators at that time. Uh, again, had a place in public light through performance, and a lot of this performing as a safe space to be in the public space was part of this nightlife. Again, so that those possibilities of this space, I just wanted to try to think about that not as like the dominant form as the answer to how we proceed and become more democratic. And because a lot of things that like Derek Bell, who's from the Hill District, kind of one of the founding members
Yes.
of critical race theory, he's talking about how these struggles, freedom struggles, have been co-opted by power structures, and they're taking the moral stance to erase the work that a lot of these organizations have done, such like the Musicians Union, a local union, where they're creating a system that is integrated and inclusive, and then that's erased in the name of a top-down sort of larger structure that requires integration on a different terms, and then the destruction of these destruction of this kind of institutions that had been built up over 30, 40 years. So yeah, I think about Derek Bell's work a lot. He's kind of come back and been demonized by people like Christopher Rufo, and this whole thing of critical race theory has really gotten a strange second life. Uh, with conservative I'm going to use the word thinkers, but conservative activists. And even the word activist is interesting now that how that's been repurposed. But I think it's very timely to go back and think about their work in relationship to civil rights, because we're very much in that moment right now. The 1965 Civil Rights Law and EEOC and Title IX, and all these things are the main talking points that are determining what's happening in the government, what's happening in the universities, and we really have to start using that language to push back and not let them demonize the ideas of Derek Bell and a lot of these thinkers.
I think one of in my own research and writing that I constantly come by and use and activate myself is his theory of interest convergence, right? That any gains that are um, achieved by Black American communities are often not because of a white supremacist allowance, but because there's something to be gained out of it from the white American community, and how that's the top-down power structure. That's his way of defining what you're characterizing so beautifully and clearly in Jazz on the Hill. And you actually really go deep into this dynamic between Black American and white American communities. You speak about the film Route 66
Mm,
and its narrative, and you write about the hurricane in the film being the archetype of the jazz club that becomes cinematic Hollywood, right? And you also write a good example is when you discuss the film Roots. You write the story positions jazz as an underappreciated art form that requires white validation and support to realize its potential as a cultural force. And then later on, you write in this on the same page, underlying this narrative is a recurring theme of a white search for Black authenticity, as well as white anxieties over exclusion from Black culture. Incredible sentence. And also this idea that the white search for Black authenticity is a way to confirm white authenticity, should it be able to pin down Black authenticity for itself, right? And that is where that anxiety comes from. It's like, well, if we're not able to be there, experience it, then we can't define it, and so therefore define ourselves.
hmm
And that is such a strong dynamic that you condensed into like three sentences. And I
mm,
wanted you to kind of expound upon that observation as you've kind of contemporarily experienced, the Hill District entering your own, life geography, your own geography as a musician that's traveling around the world and making all of these connections through your own experiences and writing.
mm. There's a lot going on there. I thanks for bringing that back, because I that experience with finding that Route 66 episode was really interesting to me, and one of my editors was like, this should be a separate article. You should get rid of this from the book. And I kind of pushed to keep it because it did feel like a little bit of an aside, but to me it tied so many of these things together. If you don't know that, I mean, like, I didn't know about Route 66 before. Did you know about that show? It
I
ran.
had I had heard about it in my grandparents on my father's side, kind of. It
Okay.
was in the background, but I was like, I'm
hmm
not watching that. I
So
was young
it's
enough to be like, I'm not watching that.
So it's like two young college guys, they're in this fancy Corvette and they're driving, and each episode they end up in a new community and they have to kind of solve some sort of problem basically as
It
they're
sounds like
discovering.
a softer Fear and Loathing
Oh yeah, interesting. I was thinking of what's that On the Road, Jack Kerouac. It's
as
sort of like
well.
young men finding themselves through the freedom to hitchhike or drive, the mobility to move around the United States and use the resources of the United States to build your character and your center yourself, So there's
There's your next book.
oh, okay. So this is a time period when the United States is building a highway system that again extends that mobility and makes that mobility, very like accessible to some and not others. And it's also the time period when the Green Book is like still an active resource for African Americans to navigate. movement through the United States. And so I was, what was the core of the question, so I don't get too off
It's
here?
about how these representations, you said that they're really about white anxieties over exclusion from Black culture and how
Hmm.
that's related to a white search for Black authenticity. Because
Hmm.
I'm glad you didn't take it out. I do think it should be something else as well, but I'm glad that it's here because attaching the research about dynamics of integration, de facto and de jure, to in the Hill District to these huge media representations, really kind of opens up this question about, well, what is the actual historic relationship between the white American communities and Black American communities, and how important Black culture is to almost like a white search for the best and the worst for itself in that context. And we have the examples: Route 66, Jack Kerouac, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Hardy Boys, right? We're thinking about like white access to space and adventure as a source of making, and how often that adventure, even in H.P. Lovecraft, appears, right, with people of
Hmm.
color, with Black people, tan people. And so it's about that relationship, right? Like that white anxiety and the search for Black authenticity on the part of
Mm.
whiteness, and how that's still kind of the dynamic we're dealing with today.
Yeah, and this goes back to minstrelsy in the 19th century as performances of racial identities and appropriation of racial identities, and the riffing on those. And um, the thing that I really learned by doing this book, because a book is a very extended process of just trying to learn through articulation, and it's a painful process where you're trying to make these ideas in words, and then you're like, oh, that's an idea now that I can kind of, so I've reified it, and now I can kind of like live with it. Um,
It is indeed
so
painful. I'm
it
glad
is
that
very, it's so painful. Uh, so I started to think about jazz as a way for people to enter into different spaces. So like one of the things I learned about is like Duke Ellington performing in the Cotton Club in Harlem, which was really a place that only white audiences were allowed to go into. But then it was broadcast. It was one of the first major broadcasts of jazz, and that music was entering into thousands of homes, people's homes. That music was coming into their homes, people that never would have been to going to New York or let alone going to Harlem. Um, and then Route 66, I was like, again, oh, they're bringing literally the space of the hurricane into people's homes, into these growing suburbs, and again, places where people might not have actually gone to those. So, that the actual hurricane was used, and there's that scene. It's not long, but the camera moves into the hurricane, and to my knowledge, it's the only footage that exists of that space that's moving image footage, and you just get a glimpse of the dynamic, and it's really beautiful. Um, and so, that Route 66 was bringing that space, which was a home space. Well, I try to argue that these clubs were, in what bell hooks might call a home space. It was not just a business, but a space of social relationships and interfamiliar relationships, all these things that were going on. So there was bringing that space into, I guess white spaces and white homes. And then, but these clubs were also places where this kind of it was a place that was welcoming to everybody. From larger Pittsburgh, it was serving a larger community, so there was a physical environment where you could kind of be to understand what it meant to be in this Hill District community, what it meant to participate in this. So it was I was just thinking about that movement of the way that jazz facilitated that kind of movement of ideas and of people in ways that really went against the grain of what the dominant narrative of American society was. And again, that was my experience of just coming to this topic was like I felt like I was moving against the grain by participating in this music and doing things that were not generally encouraged through just societal norms. And so this idea, yeah, you have to reckon with like this idea you were talking about white anxiety about trying to, I guess, appropriate or understand or somehow control Black authenticity in these spaces. And I think that's a huge part of the sort of the 60s identity of white, young white people discovering their freedom from, or like, kind of a hippie mentality that's part of this sort of like they appropriate some of these ideals to kind of find themselves and break away from a white larger narrative, post-war narrative about what kind of lives they're supposed to be living. And I'm not sure how often I mean, that story is told, but I think that's a big part of that sort of how that
because
becomes. Yeah, go
because
ahead.
it was something very poignant for me as a reader, because in the current moment we're seeing kind of old images, old simulacras of whiteness that were never really achieved, right? Being used as a kind of form of propaganda to boost up these morals and these values, which somehow necessitate the destruction or the sabotage of any community that is defined outside of a white community or whiteness itself. And so seeing this kind of old image reassert itself made me think about how it is in these places, right? These third spaces, as academia is called to call places like the Hurricane and the Crawford Grill, are the site of practicing a future in which these two communities are demonstrated to have, one, always been connected in reality, right? And always kind of interacting and engaging and at points needing one another, right? That's something I discussed with Dr. Etta Fields Black when I interviewed her about her book Combi, and she was like, "No, it took coalition. It took white people and Black people coming together in order to overcome this horrific institution and to have it end. And of course, Black people freed themselves, but other people became invested in their freedom as well, and that was a great help, right? And then here in the 1960s, you see that dynamic coming up again, that coalition being created between identities, allowing ourselves to positively co-create in futuristic spaces like the Hurricane, like the
Mm,
Crawford Grill, and how it became a necessity for white supremacist structures to destroy them, to interrupt them, to make them dangerous and therefore not palatable for a lot of humans that had the choice not to be in those spaces.
mm.
And it's probably more of a statement than a question, but it really tied together these moments across history, right? Your book thinking about Combi, thinking about this, and thinking about now, and this
Mm.
really unexplored, if not muted, relationship between familial relationship between white American communities and Black American communities.
And I leave the book kind of open with this idea of the community, jazz as a community archive to
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't able to dig into it as much, but it's where my head is now is how does this memory of these communities and this tradition of imagining and creating future spaces of socialization and community in America, how is that informing what's happening now? Because we're really in a moment in post-industrial United States where our cities are, for the first time since the 1950s, the population is increasing. Pittsburgh's population used to be 650,000, 1950. Now it's 300 something thousand. Same in Buffalo, Cleveland, Baltimore. All these cities are saw this steady decline of people moving out and into the suburbs, white flight, and all of these things, and then neighborhoods like the Hill District becoming what developers call green space. That's just ultimately the result of property values dropping to the point where it's more expensive to maintain the property than it is the value of property, and so it goes into disuse and it becomes torn down, and we have an incredible amount of open space in a place like the Hill District.
Mm-hmm.
It has been redeveloped by organizations such as the Hill CDC. So I guess I'm saying all this because I'm like, how does this how is this narrative still informing actual policy that is shaping how our cities are changing And if you've lived in Pittsburgh for 10 years, you've seen East Liberty change extremely quickly. You've seen uh, yeah, Lawrenceville change extremely
Absolutely.
fast. The Hill District is in the midst of a very major shift, and it's a center part of a city. There's there's a lot of vested interest there. There's the the city owns a lot of property. The Hill CDC owns a lot. There's a we're in a moment where things are going to change very quickly, and this is also part of the story of Detroit and Buffalo and Cleveland. And so I
Mhm.
my head is in that spot where I do feel like we're in this new era that's informed by all these things that have happened in this past 70 years. And jazz is a part of that story. It's like one way of looking through that lens as a as a way that these communities have created incredible legacies, really, and how is that going to inform what's going to continue in these spaces, or whether it will, how these spaces will continue to operate as African American communities or historically Black spaces, or not, and how do we have that conversation forward?
So I think it's like Jazz in the Hill is like it's a powerful book, and it made me kind of take a beat to sit down and like step back, right? Whereas I loved my experience in Pittsburgh, return to Pittsburgh often, don't live far away. I'm in Baltimore, another comparable city to Pittsburgh itself. Um, the pauses that it gave me, the things it gave me to reflect on, made sparked a change in me, a change in my thinking, right? A change in the way that I characterize history in my own head as someone who's also a historian.
Hmm.
What is different about you now? How did your research and taking on the painful and probably at times exhilarating when you are on the rails, kind of actually typing it all out, um, change you as an individual and a musician or reaffirm for you?
Um, what's different now in terms of after having done this work, you mean,
Yeah,
or?
its effect on you personally and personally as a musician, just as a human being.
Hmm. Um, I'm I still feel this story is very much in a process of being told. So I don't feel like when you write this history, I think I'm trying to write it in a way that sort of makes it connected to this moment. So I'm trying to think about this moment we're in as a major time of change, not just politically, but like the way that the way we live in our cities is changing quickly. So I hope there's a way to connect to what I think was a very important moment in American history when incredible ideas were created, incredible legacies of intellectual activities were formed. Just the kind of I think there are kind of amazing moments in our history where things come together in ways that we're able to achieve really remarkable things, like John Coltrane's Love Supreme. How that can't be made in any other moment than that.
Mm-hmm.
And we have that resource of American popular music as a guiding force. What Cornel West calls love warriors. He talks about John Coltrane as love warrior. Like, yeah, I mean, it is a resource. It is a guide for us to kind of ground ourselves and think about ways of moving forward. So I guess that's what I think about it as. Yes, I do sit and practice guitar. I'm trying to always trying to be a better musician. Um, but it's not just about learning these notes and learning this repertoire and playing it to some kind of degree of virtuosity. It's thinking about this as an ongoing uh, struggle towards something Octavia Butler, or like thinking about uh, this ongoing struggle that's very much we're not just sitting on our laurels and imagining that democracy is going to somehow function on its own. We have to draw on something to move forward. So what is that we're going to be drawing on?
I think that's an excellent question, right, to end with, right? It's like how um, I saw Jessica Caramore perform last night, and she asked the same question you just asked, right? what is the action, the placemaking that we're going to do where our ideas can come together, where we can push forward from the examples that are set here, right? And communities like the Hill District and its musical communities, like how are we going to move forward um, with our own source of like people power and all the ways it shows up in music and mutual aid, music as a form of mutual aid, emotional, psychological mutual aid, right? So I think that's a beautiful question to end with. I am really grateful for the opportunity to have like read, the book. You can kind of like see like it's kind of like so many lines, so many things to remember. But you've made a great example as a writer and a researcher, and just a lot of thanks for all the pain. As a fellow writer, I know exactly what you're
Thank you.
talking
It's
about.
always it's a great honor to have your reading read, but it's also terrifying at the same time because these ideas are out there, and you hope you hope they land well.
No, they landed well with me. I encourage everybody, if you haven't read it, go get it. Jazz in the Hill by Colter Harper. Don't be scared of it because it's kind of an academic text. Coulter's a great writer. You're not going to miss a thing. You're not going to be confused. You're not going to have to go back and read it twice, unless, of course, you love it and have to read it again. So support Coulter. He is on his way to Ghana
Yeah,
soon to continue with some other projects. And thank you for being on Lit Friday and for having this conversation with me.
great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.